Thank you, Edward. Now I have a lavalier mic. How does it sound, everybody? Can you hear me? Good. Boy, I tell you what, I thank you for that very kind introduction, Edward, but I've got to do something about that bio, because as anyone can tell from looking at me, I am certainly not an outstanding young alumnus of anything, but if they have an award for an outstanding older alum, or really quite beyond middle-aged, I'm definitely up for being a candidate for that. I'm really delighted to have you here. Thank you for taking time out of your busy lives to talk with us together. I'm really grateful to the Center and to Edward and other sponsoring organizations to give me a chance to be in this beautiful city and on this beautiful campus. I'm particularly grateful to my friends Kim and Tony, who are here, and I have to say it's a little worrisome as well. They have 5 children and they got babysitters, and this is date night, which says to me it's a pretty high bar for entertainment, and I'll know if I'm not scoring if I just see them get up and leave, which they've actually told me there's a reasonably good chance they will do. So anyway, I'm glad to be here. I'm actually a very funny person, but I'm going to talk about serious stuff, and maybe we'll laugh a little and then maybe we'll cry a little bit, but that's sort of what human rights work is all about. So, as Edward mentioned in the embarrassing biography, I did spend about 20 plus years in the human rights monitoring and reporting field, and I really treasure that time working for 2 excellent organizations. I loved my time working on Capitol Hill as well, but that was so long ago I've pretty much forgotten it mostly. But I loved working as an advocacy person, a government relations liaison for Human Rights Watch and Physicians for Human Rights, but and I love their work, and we depend on it. All of us in the human rights movement, but it was painful work as well. And I was thinking about telling you a little bit about my past time in the human rights field, and also which sort of is intertwined with my faith journey. I remembered something I hadn't thought about for a long time. It was a trip I took to Guatemala in about 1985. Now, I was not usually the person to go into the field to gather information on human rights abuses. I lacked courage, and B, my patch was with U.S. Congress, and I was a lobbyist, a human rights lobbyist. But for some reason, I tagged along on a trip to collect information about human rights abuses in Guatemala. Now, for those of you that remember, the mid-'80s were a truly horrible time for that small country. There was an insurgency in the countryside and a massive counterinsurgency campaign against it, and hundreds of thousands of indigenous people were killed, and many, many, many thousands of young students and clergy and others were disappeared, which is a technical term for almost certainly dead, but disappeared after they were taken into custody of the authorities. And my colleague Juan Mendez, who's one of the really great heroes of the human rights movement, that it was my great honor to work with. Juan is now the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture. Juan is from Argentina and was a torture victim himself, and came to work for Human Rights Watch when I was there, and was my closest colleague. And he and I were together on this trip, and we were interviewing, or Juan was interviewing. I didn't speak Spanish, but I had a translator with me quietly, bringing me along, and he was interviewing an indigenous mother, and she had a picture of her disappeared son. And we were there to gather information that would later turn out to be a report. And as she was telling us every detail of what had happened when the authorities came and picked up her son, who was a college student, and she had every little detail and was very carefully telling. She had a big old pile of papers, and she told us what he was wearing, and she just had tears running down her face as she was talking to us, and she kept saying, he was such a good boy, don't you think so? And it was almost unbearable, and to sit through that interview. And what was almost the most unbearable was this notion that she had, and that we must have had, that telling the story would somehow make things different for her and for her boy, who was almost, was certainly dead. And that, I think, as I think about that, the whole premise of the human rights field that I kind of grew up in. I joined Human Rights Watch when it was only a couple years old, and I left 14 years later when it was very highly developed, and we kind of grew up together. But the whole premise of human rights reporting and documentation is based on the assumption that the spotlight of attention will make things better, that if you bring these atrocities to light, that there'll be something will pressure governments, or in some cases rebel groups that were the responsible for atrocities, will make it different and make it better. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes that was true. And often it just wasn't. I mean, it just became palpably clear that there would be certain governments, including many that our own government supported, many supported by the Soviet Union, because my highlight of my human rights career was back during in those days was during the Cold War. So we had just a tidal wave of atrocities on both sides of the ideological divide, and my beloved organization, Human Rights Watch, worked on all of them. But the work meant human rights monitoring, bringing out the information, and there were some times when governments would be shamed into doing the right thing, and then there were many times when they were not. And I think that was my first real taste of the sort of our own powerlessness in the face of an individual loss and death, and it was a very uncomfortable experience. I mostly avoided those experiences, however, and did my work in Washington, where I had a ball and got to talk to members of Congress and testify in Congress and talk to the State Department, and felt like I was really doing good in the world. I would have to say that the seminal event in my life, but more importantly in Rwandan lives, was the genocide of 1994, and that, I think, was a coincidence of two low points in my life. One, it was the very lowest point of my disgust and dismay with God. I was not a believer. I was an atheist. If you can call an atheist somebody who cursed God every single day for the condition of the world. So I don't know. Do you feel betrayed by something you don't believe in? I don't know. Well, so you could call me an atheist, or maybe a reluctant, twisted, pissed off non-believer or something, but I was those things from the time I was about 16 years old, but I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But if I didn't believe in a good God and a crappy world, I did believe in us. I believed in the power of human rights advocacy. I believed in the power of truth-telling and the power of witness to atrocities. And my organization, Human Rights Watch, brought all of that to bear very powerfully from the minute the killing began on April 6th, 1994 in Kigali till it ended 100 days later with about 800,000 dead at the hands of this rump genocidal regime. And at that point, my faith in us was completely gone as well, because we brought our best to the endeavor, and we absolutely failed to make even the slightest bit of difference in the international community's response to just massive, massive killing, much of it just plain butchery with clubs and machetes that could have been stopped with a serious numbers of armored personnel vehicles rumbling across this country the size of the state of Maryland, and a reasonably equipped unit of soldiers that had the mandate and the orders and the rules of the road to protect civilians. But that didn't happen, and Rwanda is still suffering to this day. We're almost at the 20th anniversary of that most appalling of events in my adult life, and certainly in theirs. So I didn't stop working in international human rights. I really loved it, but I did have doubt, and increasing doubt, I think, about the efficacy of human rights reporting. And I had a very strong conviction that what we lacked during the Rwanda agenda was an outpouring of rage and demand from the American people that the killing must stop. And we didn't have to be expert in how it should be stopped, but our policymakers were not hearing that. And that really, my organization, Human Rights Watch, didn't have a grassroots base. And so our policymakers didn't hear from people like you, and they didn't hear from students at Duke University, they didn't hear from, moms and friends and, people of goodwill as the killing and the butchery, approached tens of thousands every day. They didn't hear that the United States, with its great might and wealth, can't we do something to save this minority from extinction? And that was a big lesson for me, that for all of our access to, at an elite level, our access to the UN Security Council, our op-eds, our radio interviews, what we didn't bring to the table was the power of a democracy, of people saying, please make this stop. And I haven't forgotten it, and it is one of the reasons I really cherish working for International Justice Mission, because we do actually have thousands of friends around the country that we don't work on genocide. I hope there will never be another one. We work on a different kind of human rights violation, which I'll talk a little bit about. But we know we have friends in every state, most especially here in North Carolina, that if a balloon goes up for us, we can call our friends in every state, and they can contact their members of Congress and say, please help. And you can bet we will. So one about the time of the Rwanda genocide, so my takeaway from the genocide is that there is not a God. If there is a God, it's either a weak God, in which case I'm not interested, or a really cruel and withholding God, also not interested, but most likely there's no God at all. And but interestingly, Gary Haugen, the founder of International Justice Mission, his takeaway from the Rwanda genocide was completely different. He was the first UN investigator. He was actually working for the United States Department of Justice, and he was seconded to the UN from the US Department of Justice to be the first UN investigator, the first boots on the ground, and within days of the end of the killing. And he was much more involved, saw much more of the horror of the genocide than I did. But he came back from his time in the field, where he was collecting mountains of testimony and seeing literally the piles of bodies in the churches where tens of thousands of people had clustered in hopes of safety, which turned out to be a false hope. And they lay there in some churches to this day as a reminder. He came back with a completely different conviction about God. His conviction about God was that God wants his people to do something about this. And Gary came back with the fire in his heart that he wanted, as a Christian lawyer, to be able to use his skills and his passion for the plight of the poor and victims of violence, and he wanted to do something to help. So he set about, with this idea as a Justice Department lawyer, and one of the first people he talked to in the human rights field was me. And here I am, an atheist. I'm at Human Rights Watch. I'm also, just for the record, a leftist and a feminist. And this evangelical guy comes to see me and didn't have a high opinion of evangelicals or crew cuts, and which he had, really bristly, sticking straight up. But he absolutely captured my heart. And what really captured my heart was his vision of Christians banding together to do two things. One, bring the news to American churches, particularly mainstream and conservative Protestant denominations, that God hates injustice and wants his people to do something about it. And then to actually send lawyers and people from the United States into foreign countries where we learn of violence against poor people from local missionaries or from people who bring the information to us and help them. That seemed to me to be a radical idea, and I thought it was great. And we became friends. I really do like to tell most audiences that IJM was actually all my idea, and now it's full blown. I like to say that even more now that we have about 550 staff. Gary was employee number one, and I'm so happy about that memory of seeing the little bit of the birth of IJM in our conversations. But we stayed friends. I stayed in we adopted two little kids, and I eventually went over to Physicians for Human Rights to get a a job that wasn't quite so demanding so I could have a little more family time. But Gary and I stayed friends, and I became friends with other IJMers as they came on board, including Ruth McGinn, who's here, Gary's special assistant, and I just watched out for this little fledgling organization. I was at their first event where there were about 10 people, and half of them were Gary's family, and and I just helped out of my hip pocket when I could, and it really doesn't have anything to do with me, but I do treasure those memories. And importantly, Gary and I, as friends, and my husband and Gary's wife, the families became friends. We all had, kids under 3, and it was just great to get together. And I just was so interested in this guy who thought exactly the way I did about international human rights, who believes in God, and I don't. And I'm just intrigued by that. I was raised as a Christian, and I became an unchristian. I mean, I like to say at IJM we have all these lovely, wonderful young interns that come in, and I do a little small group with them every training class, and almost every one of them has some really important and meaningful faith experience at about the age of 16, where they really accepted Christ in their lives. And I, at the age of 16, really threw Christ out of my life. I mean, it was the exact reverse, and it actually happened because of sorrow and suffering, where I did not see God's presence. Just briefly, my beloved grandmother, who was a missionary in India and was the most faithful person I knew, and was a huge influence in my life. I do think that because of God's hand in my life that I didn't know at the time, but her hand in my life is why I ended up in the human rights field, and I hope she knows it. She died at the age of 95 about 30 years ago. She, when my grandfather died, he was an old man. It was not an atrocious, unjust death. He just died of cancer, and she lost her mind completely, and lost her faith. And I was there with her, and I was seeing that, and it, I wouldn't say I was a passionate Christian. I was a 16-year-old, who was a mainstream. I never gave it a thought, but I sure did give it a thought when I saw my truly angel of this saint who had served the Lord her whole life and loved the Lord, and found him missing in action when she needed him the most. And that made a very, very powerful impact on me. Her faith recovered. She was in a very deep, life-threatening depression for about a year. She got better and regained her faith as joyfully as she had ever had it, but I certainly didn't gain mine. And we continued to be very close, and I don't know why I didn't just understand this to be episodic mental illness, which she did suffer from for the rest of her life. And she did indeed lose her connection to the Lord. But all I knew was that if there ever was a God, he was not there for my grandmother in her time of sorrow, and it really, really sealed the deal for me, and not in a good way. So then I spent the next 30 years in the human rights field, and I'm surrounded by, well, I don't want to be too dramatic. I wasn't surrounded by pain and suffering. Our investigators and researchers are surrounded by pain and suffering. I'm a lobbyist, right? I'm doing fine, but I certainly was aware of, terrible, terrible suffering, and had occasion in a long career to work on, rape and war crimes and genocide, and work meaning trying to get policymakers interested to do something about it, political imprisonment, terrible torture, and just every appalling thing human beings could ever do to one another. And meantime, little IJM is growing up and getting bigger, and I'm still in touch with Gary. And I remember a conversation we had about the Rwanda genocide, which I don't actually talk about ceaselessly, but often. I remember saying to him, how can you, really just angrily, even though he was my friend, I was just so angry with him that he could believe that there was a good God, in the light of what had happened. And I think I've heard this phrase attributed to Elie Wiesel, but I don't know actually whether he said it. But there is this phrase that exactly sums up where I was in terms of God. And it was, you can either believe in a sovereign God who is who's sovereign in the world and cares about the world and is powerful. Or you can believe in the Holocaust, but not both. You can't hold those thoughts both. They can't both be true. And that is exactly what I thought. How can both these things be true? And Gary said, when we were talking about the genocide, he said, well, Holly, I don't know. I don't know why the genocide happened, but I do know that it is not all God has in mind for all those little ones who died. And I know that he will wipe every tear from their eyes, which of course is that wonderful, I had no idea. It was a quote from the book of Revelations, but I learned since. Whatever, I never forgot it. I never forgot it. And it matters to me a lot because I see these as little milestones in my faith journey that's just like tangled up in a complete knot with human rights work and with unchecked suffering. I think a big part of my professional, a big sort of upheaval in my professional life and in my spiritual life actually came in about 2003 when IJM's Sharon Cohn, she's now Sharon Cohn Wu, married since those days, but she had become a very close friend. She works for IJM and was head of our overseas activities. And in the early part of the decade, IJM investigators had learned from some missionaries and humanitarian workers that there was a neighborhood, brothel, squalid little slum neighborhood outside of Phnom Penh, where very, very young children were being sold for sex. And so IJM, which did not have an office in Cambodia, but heard about it and sent some investigators to go check it out, and went undercover posing as foreign pedophiles, and they found, yes, indeed, it was true that very tiny girls were being sold for sex with Westerners, for the most part, and all you had to do if you were, a white man, was ride through that neighborhood on the back of a moped, and teen boys and pimps would gather around and ask you if you wanted to buy small, and lead you right to a little child as young as 5 or 6, and they gathered an abundance of evidence of dozens and dozens of young prepubescent girls for sale, and they brought the information to the Cambodian police to ask them to go find the girls, and the Cambodian police did exactly nothing, smiled politely and showed our investigators the door. So IJM didn't know yet what to do. Sharon asked me if I could pull a few human rights friends together and talk about it. And she brought over this grainy black and white undercover film footage that our investigators, wearing little button, little bitty button, what do you call them, cameras. And they'd taken this footage in a backpack and they are posing as customers. And it really, she brought it, she showed it to us. And, I actually like to think of myself as pretty tough. But that was the most grotesque thing I have ever seen in my life. And at a very personal level, these littlest girls that were for sale were Vietnamese. Now, we're in Cambodia, but the girls, and this has always been the case, continues to be the case, the youngest kids for sale for sex in Cambodia are Vietnamese. The Vietnamese are despised because of the occupation, and there is a substantial minority and a large, sort of very much criminally engaged Vietnamese neighborhood from whence these kids are being taken and sold to pedophiles. And I have a daughter who's Vietnamese, and when I saw that undercover film footage, Josie was 5. She came to us when she was 5 months old, and she's just the teeniest little pea. To this day, she's tiny. I can practically carry her now. She's 16. She's 5 feet tall, weighs about 100 pounds. But when she was 5, she weighed about 35 pounds, and I like to carry her around on my hip because I could still do that because she was so little. But this is just all to say that I know exactly how big the body of a 5-year-old Vietnamese girl is. And to see kids that look just like my girl and could easily have been my girl or yours for that matter, being offered for sex. One little gal was so small, she was being held up in the arms of a couple of other girls, and I just thought, well, does it. I can't stand that. And nothing else quite stomped my heart like that. And I thought two things. One, I thought, this has to stop. And second, I thought, why don't I go work for IJM? Well, indeed, we helped a little, but God helped more, and IJM, through American pressure on the Cambodian authorities, the American ambassador to Cambodia came down pretty hard on the Cambodian government, and said that if you don't deal with this child sexual exploitation issue, you've got some serious foreign aid that's at risk. And the Cambodians, seeing which side of the bread the butter was on, as the saying goes, saluted smartly and said, yes, we will help. And in fact, they did. And that was the beginning of a decade-long or longer engagement between IJM and the Cambodian police and court system, and many, many, many hundreds of girls rescued since that time, and hundreds of people, bad people who went to jail and remain in jail. The face of Cambodia with regard to child sex trafficking has been transformed. That's God's work, and that's Cambodia's work, and that's IJM's work, but I'm really glad to be alive to see that miracle. But in any event, I wanted to go work for IJM, and took me a while to get there because I was not Christian, and I didn't actually get the point that IJM, I knew it was Christian, but I didn't know you had to be Christian to work there, because I'm the best and I'm friends with the boss, and surely they would be very excited about having me on board. So I told Gary Haugen that in about 2003, and it was an awkward moment. It was a long, awkward moment, because Gary, I'm sure, knew that if I had been rejected because I didn't have faith, it would push me away. And so he just took the route of not saying anything at all to my offer of, how about I come work for you? And that was the right thing. And eventually we were able to talk about it, and God gave Gary the words to say and me the ears to hear that this wasn't the time. And in fact, 3 years later in 2006, it became the time. And I'm really grateful. I'm a toddler in the faith, and if you'd like to read about how much of a toddler in the faith I am, you can buy several hundred copies of my book. But IJM has been a wonderful place to work. So I'd like to talk a little bit about faith challenge, if you'll let me. Faith challenges now as still a fairly new believer. Now I admit that the timing of my conversion and my being offered a job at IJM is a little suspect. It happened within about a year, but it was the real deal, and I did come to believe in God, and IJM is really the reason why, because actually the intellectual defenses I had against God had everything to do with the world is a shithole and God doesn't care. But in fact, Gary Haugen and Sharon and Ruthie and the team had another answer, which is that God hates injustice, and there's scripture to prove it in case you don't believe me, and has a plan for dealing with it, and that plan is his people. And as Gary likes to say, and there is no plan B. So we're like looking around for the grown-ups, and it's us. And that offered this incredibly liberating third choice to either you can believe in a good God or the Holocaust, but not both. There's a third choice, and it was incredibly life-giving. So my intellectual defenses against belief in a good God started to crumble. Not quick either. I was like the world's slowest study. It took about a decade, but I did come to faith. So now I'm at IJM, and I love it a lot. I'm never leaving. They'll have to literally cart me away. I do feel that it's a great privilege to work with believers, but I would say that doubts about a good God in a lousy world haven't been quelled by any stretch. And in fact, I think that because IJM's model, which is to literally serve one victim at a time, or we actually serve hundreds of victims at a time, but the whole approach is to go in and secure protection and justice for this one girl, the second girl in the brothel. And that's the way it happened in the early years, one case at a time. And it doesn't matter how long it will take. If it takes 8 times going back to a brothel to look for a girl, then IJMers will go back 8 times as a sort of model of bringing justice to scale. It's a crazy one. You know, the per unit cost is like, we could buy everybody a house. But the point is, IJM will do anything to, I mean, obviously, all the right things, not anything, but we don't shoot people, you know, we don't bribe, but we'll do everything it takes to get relief for our clients, and our clients are children who've been raped. We have 5 offices that get those kids to safety and to care. We have trauma-focused care and restoration for the victim, and simultaneously gather evidence with working alongside the local police, gather evidence of the crime, and assist the police in the apprehension and the prosecution of the perpetrator. It's a unique model. There's nobody else in the world that does this, because in most of these countries, the police, not only would you not go to the police if you have a problem, police are the problem. They, broken and corrupt and underpaid police forces will prey on poor people, and no one is more familiar with that than IJM. But what are the poor to do? What's the mother of an 8-year-old who was raped on her way to school? Who's she going to turn to? You know, what is she going to do? Have a Take Back the Night rally? No. She needs what you and I would want if our child were violated. You want the police to come in here, you want your child to be treated tenderly and carefully, and you want the person who raped her to go away in handcuffs forever, if possible. And that is what the poor don't have. And so IJM, literally with this incredibly radical model of let's just go bring justice and protection to a handful of people. And that's what it was in the early days, and now it's thousands. But it's still every single person is precious. But here's what that does when you get up really close to how precious each client, each child, each adult that was rescued from a stone quarry and as a bonded slave, how you see how precious each is, and you're just overwhelmed at the enormity of, you know that there are so many more around them that we didn't find, and that is really tough. And it is toughest of all on our investigators and social workers who get and lawyers too, get really close to these people. I mean, the investigators, when they go out looking for girls in brothels, or they go to a stone quarry and they see the terrible, terrible literal slavery in which people are living, or they gather information about child fisher boys on boats in Ghana, they just live with that memory, and they know that we sometimes don't get the people that were the children and the adults that we find, and they are living right up close and personal with that suffering. And as I was telling a young woman this afternoon, secondary trauma is nothing to be fooled with. Our Christian faith is an essential source of support for us at IJM, though I don't mean to imply you have to be a Christian to do this work. That is not correct. Our group can only do this work with God's help. But secondary trauma for our investigators and our staff, particularly in the field, is a very real issue, and we pay close attention to it. But I got a little taste of it myself this summer with a case that just was so ghastly that I was just back shaking my fist. I wasn't cursing God, but as in the old days, but I really I just could not believe this case. It was a little girl, 14-year-old in Rwanda, who we call Juliet. That's not her real name. But she had been abducted and taken to a house and raped over the course of 2 weeks by 2 men. They left her in the locked house, which caught on fire and burned, and so did her legs, which had to be amputated because they were so badly burned. So now we have, as my colleague and friend Philip Langford says, this is a case where we just need God to make everything new. And many of us at IJM, it was just about the worst thing we'd heard. Here's this little girl, burns are terribly, terribly painful. Here's this is this 14-year-old who's been gang raped for weeks, and she's burned so badly, and you know how painful burns are, and both legs have been taken off. And living as a disabled person in our country is hard enough. In the developing world, you're pretty well finished. This child cannot walk. And I went down the hall to my good friend, Sharon Cohn-Wu, and I just said, Sharon, why doesn't the Lord just take her? You know, I just thought it was so wrong that she should have to live with such pain. And she reminded me that the Lord is the giver and taker of life, and that there must be a reason why she cannot be in Jesus' arms as we speak. But it's those kinds of cases that really test my faith, and I think the randomness too. You know, for every miracle, and one of our staff who recently left to take another job talked about the joy of having a front row seat to miracles every day, and that is the way it is at IJM. But we also have a front row seat to terrible depravity and suffering, and we just know it very well. And that issue of randomness is really difficult, I think, for any person of goodwill who cares about the world. Like, why did that mom's child get raped and have her legs amputated, but my 16-year-old is fine, you know? And it's very hard for me sometimes, and this is a spiritual weakness that I have trouble with gratitude for all of my gifts, because I know that others don't have them. I mean, I think all of us have to be uncomfortable with that, and we're supposed to be. But I at one point, when I just was so at the end of my intellectual ability to really figure out randomness and what God means by that, and what are we supposed to think about that as believers in a good God, and I went and talked to one of our investigators who I love a lot, and he has been a person who's been in the field for many years who investigates child sex trafficking, and I just said, how do you live with this? You know, the girls we didn't get, the girls you know that are out there by the thousands that we'll never know, how can you bear it? And he said that the most beautiful thing, he said that the only way he could do this work and go out, get up and go out day after day after day looking in the most dark, squalid places on earth was when we had a case and we were not succeeding, and we could not find the girl, because the brothel owners, you know, when they get tipped off by the police, they just move these kids around, and you know, it's really heartbreaking for the investigators. But he said, I just take the case, and here's what I do, and I tell all the other investigators they have to do the same thing. I just visualize everything I know about the girl. He was the one who did the investigation and the rescue of one girl whose name is Mamoni, who we looked for, and we went out with police on 8 separate occasions over a course of about 3 months, and indeed they did find her eventually. But he said, I think about the girl, and I think about everything I know, her name, the sound of her voice, what she looks like, you know, and I just have to mentally just lay the case at the foot of Jesus. Literally, and just go through this very deliberate, mindful exercise of just to say, we will help, we will bring everything we've got to the table, and we know it's not enough, and you will take our loaves and fishes and work the miracle. And I really like that. I get very frustrated that we don't get to actually see the 5,000 fed. But I believe in it, and I do believe God takes our offerings and does things in the Lord's own time, which is eternity, to make things right and wipe away every tear from their eye. Well, I go on and on. That's my style. I did want to just say something that I think is really interesting to me, returning to that original theme about sort of policy work versus hands-on individual casework. I think that because individual work on individual cases of pushing these things through these broken justice pipelines is so painful that, and because it is, you know that you're not, if you get 1, you're not getting 10. Let me explain what I mean. there's this tendency, I think, in the human rights field to try to work at a really high level, get up 30,000 feet so that you can sort of try to imagine something good for everybody. I remember once when I was at my previous job, Physicians for Human Rights, and I learned about this horrible crime that was occurring in Zambia. I'd read something in some human rights report about this practice where there were hundreds of very, very, very young children, toddlers, and babies who were being raped by grown men with HIV/AIDS because of the misplaced notion that comes from witchcraft and unscrupulous traditional healers that having sex with a virgin will cure you of AIDS. And it is it's quite a terrible notion, and it's widely held in much of sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Asia. So you're getting these bizarre crimes of rape of tiny people, and I just thought, oh, that's really terrible. Maybe my organization, Physicians for Human Rights, which deals with health and human rights, could offer something. And I had some ideas, and I contacted a friend in the human rights movement at another group, and I said, I was thinking about maybe my group could do something to help on this, and she was uncomfortable with it and said, well, why don't you work on something that affects more people, like domestic violence? And I don't blame her. She was sort of looking at sort of what can you do that might help the largest number of people, and I wanted to focus on the worst thing I'd ever heard of in my life, and neither of us was wrong. But in a way, I sort of compare it to the medical versus public health model. The medical model of treatment, stick with me, I know I'm all over the map here, but I'm going to bring you back. The medical model is that you have a patient, you're a doctor or a nurse practitioner, and you have a patient and they have an ailment, and you're going to do everything possible for that person. That is the medical model at its best. And it doesn't matter what it costs, we're going to throw everything we got at it. And a public health model is to sort of look at what you can do with your resources that will improve the lives of as many people as possible. Now, both are right, both are morally correct, but they can sometimes be mutually exclusive. And I really learned this tension between medical model and health model when I worked on global AIDS policy for about 5 years at my previous job. Because we didn't have very many dollars in those days, in the early days of the AIDS pandemic. We didn't have any dollars. And nobody in the public health field thought that providing expensive antiretroviral treatment in developing countries made any sense at all. If we got the scarce dollar, the last thing you're going to do is buy very expensive medication for however many people with AIDS that there were. What you're going to do is you're going to use it for prevention, and you use it for clean water, and but you got all these people that have AIDS that are going to die, and you've got a handful of crusading, docs who want to treat patients in Haiti and in South Africa just the way they would treat a patient here. And one of those docs is Paul Farmer, who is a crusading doctor and human rights activist, and one of my top heroes on this earth. And he did what people think is impossible. He actually treated patients in the poorest country in the world, Haiti, where he lived for much of his life, and he threw everything he had at the problem, and he got criticism for that, for having this medical model. And in his biography, which is called Mountains Beyond Mountains, and if you haven't read it, you should run to the bookstore, look for my book first, and then look for that book. But it's just a brilliant, brilliant book about Paul. There's a story in there that means a lot to me because I think it really captures the preciousness of the one and the needs of the many, which is really what I'm trying to drive to. Oops. But there's a story in there about Dr. Farmer, and he, in his rounds through the poorest part of Haiti, the poorest country in the world, came across a kid with cancer, bone cancer, and he was dying. And Paul, being the doctor he is, who believes that everybody gets the absolute best, especially the poorest of the poor. That's kind of his favorites. And So he did everything he could for this kid, including scaring up $25,000 to get him medevaced up to, you know, Mass General or Brigham Women, someplace where he was constantly bringing patients and stealing supplies and all kinds of really marvelous things. He's a professor at Harvard, and he would commute up to teach his class from Haiti. But so he brought this child to the United States for treatment, and the little fellow died. He didn't make it. And there were some people who were critical of Paul, including on his own team, about spending all that money. You're living in the poorest country in the world where people don't have clean water and where, you know, moms are dying in childbirth and, you know, we're scrabbling around trying to get polio vaccines, and Paul spent $25,000 on a kid who was dying. And somebody asked him, why did you treat that little boy? And he said the most brilliant thing. He said, because his mother brought him to me. And I just think, the brilliant thing about Paul Farmer is that when you figure out how to love the one really, really well, the medical model, as it were, or the IJM model, where you throw everything you've got at this one, it's actually possible that miracles can come from that and that many can be served. But I really, and I see that at IJM, where in the early days we'd have one client. I remember the early days of our India anti-slavery offices, where our staff would literally, to try to get a magistrate to come to a brick kiln where people are enslaved and working 20 hours a day and not permitted to leave, and our staff would go for days on end and do nothing but sit in the offices of those magistrates who had the power to go and call out those slaves, and their offices would close and our staff would be back there the next day in their business professional clothes, and they'd do that for months. And now we're seeing thousands of slaves being released from slavery, and the governments themselves in some of the Indian states where we work are themselves initiating rescue. But we would never have seen that kind of tipping point where you're now that ball is starting to roll if we hadn't figured it out for the one. And I do think that the moral clarity that comes from engaging very deeply in the preciousness of that one victim, and learning as you go, of course, about how to make it, how to take that experience of justice and protection to scale, is what we're starting to see. But if you never go below 30,000 feet, you never will learn how those justice systems work and don't work, and you never will figure out, you know, why the Guatemalan police have not been able to take any more than 3% of the child rape complaints that they've received, why they've never been able to take them to justice. You wouldn't know that if you weren't in there working with these kids and these individual police and pushing that case through the justice system, just like Paul Farmer wouldn't have had the authority that he has and the moral clarity about the rights of the poor to have the same drugs that are saving lives of people with AIDS in the United States, the rights of Haitians to have the same, if he were not involved in that total immersion of love and care for the one. And I think that's what God is calling us to do. It is painful to love very deeply, as we all know from our personal lives. But that is, of course, what is modeled to us. And if we can just strive with our pitiful best to be even the smallest shadow of that model, then we will have spent our time on this earth well. Well, I've talked too long, and I'm glad to take your questions and comments.